From Cairo to Cape Town, Lagos to Lamu. 54 nations, one continent, countless perspectives. Hi, I'm Warren Njoroge.
I'm Nduoko.
Welcome to Panel 54, a global perspective through an African lens. This is the podcast where we unpack power, policy, people, and the paradoxes that define our time. With nuance, with history, and a deliberate commitment to context. This is not punditry, it's perspective. It's not a briefing, it's a reframing. And it starts right here.
Youth protests have taken the African continent by storm, whether it was high cost of living in Sudan, or against police violence in Nigeria, or against a throttling finance bill in Kenya. 70% of the continent's population is willing the leadership to do right by them. Today, we talk with Thomas Mukhwana, a journalist with Africa Uncensored. His interests around social justice, overlooked African narratives, and social justice.
Yeah, glad to be here, guys.
Karibu sana.
Thomas.
We're going to shorten it to Tom. Thomas is okay, but you know whatever.
Thomas is a bit old school. Sounds biblical.
So
I'm an investigative reporter now, but I started as a fact checker, so you can say disinformation, misinformation journalist, and now investigative journalism. And that means I find myself in so many places. Could be reporting on corruption or human rights abuses. It's so many things, but in a nutshell, just an investigative journalist.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're going to jump straight into it. And what we're looking at discussing today actually is this question. Is Gen Z driving a true Pan-African revival, or are they just keyboard crusaders waiting to be co-opted? And the way I'd put that then is this. Is Gen Z activism in Africa a movement or a mirage? Yeah.
That's to me, you can see it from two perspectives.
Okay.
Right? You can see it from a cynical perspective, which is what you ended with, being co-opted, right?
Yeah.
Or you can see it from a hopeful and people just demanding a good change, which is possible perspective. And I tend to buy the second argument and point of view more.
Okay.
Because I don't like to buy into cynicism. Because cynicism is what you end up with when you don't feel like you're strong enough to cause change. And we've seen change because of uprisings. But to be fair, we've also seen change that seemed to be happening and failed to happen. Arab Spring is a great example of that.
Right.
But I tend to think it's very much possible for us to get what we want. So I think it's not a passing wind. It's something that's there to stay.
It would look as though we saw a retracting of the forces, essentially, and I'm going to say forces quite deliberately. But do we see that it is a sustained effort and a sustained attempt to then be able to achieve what the majority of the population on the African continent is looking for?
Yeah. It is sustained. It is sustained. It's everywhere. You see it in Nigeria. You see it in Burkina Faso. You see it in South Africa to a degree.
To a point, yes.
To a degree, yeah. You've seen it in Uganda, though it's been stamped down by brutal force, and you see it in Tanzania as well. I think it's sustained. It's not going to fade at any point soon. Just because of the power of what we have now, social media. We all have phones. And the difference between what we see or we saw in 2011 with the Arab Spring, that's my favorite example because it was a widespread movement across the Middle East into North Africa. We didn't have internet, and there was a completely different generation that was at the steering wheel then. Access to information is a huge element in this
okay,
movement.
While that initial opening might have sounded cynical, is it completely misplaced? The reason I ask that question is because for anything that Gen Z are doing right now, they're being loud, but are they being listened to?
Sustainability, it's not looking good. Let me just put it like that, right? It's not looking good because as much as we have loud voices advocating for actual good change, there's a question of when 2027, and there's also an argument against this, when 2027 gets here, where do we go? Like, are we still going to be on Twitter, or is it going to be more inclusive of everyone who's outside the social platforms?
Okay.
Then that begs the question, how are we doing it now, right? Are we involving people outside the internet in our conversations? And you'll see efforts in some candidates, for instance, Maraga's and I think it's Maraga. Who else? It's David Maraga and Okiya Mtata.
Yeah.
Yes, and that steering committee trying to move to the remote areas of Kenya and the areas outside Twitter. By Twitter, I mean the urban population, right? The folks on Instagram. But in Shags, it's very hard to find folks who are tapped into the hashtag reject finance bill from over there, or the hashtags that followed that.
Yeah.
So the sustainability is in that, right? Do we have a steady supply of resources to fund this movement, to give it wings and to give it legs outside the urban areas? And some might argue yes, others might argue no, because we've also seen volunteers stepping up and spreading the civic education that you were speaking of in the areas that are outside these social platforms. I think that's what's going to drive this change to give it more substance. You see, the opportunity in all of this is that Kenya, I think over 75% of folks who will be in folks who are in Kenya right now are young, can be in that category, right? And that means the election in 2027 might be heavily determined by these folks. I was looking at some TikTok stats recently, and there's around 15 million Kenyans on TikTok and Facebook.
Yeah.
The last election, around 10 million, am I wrong, total votes during that election. And so if you add the population of folks on Twitter and Facebook, well, TikTok, let's just take TikTok for instance, 15 million folks. Those people are more than the people who went to vote in 2022. So to me, that's a huge opportunity. And with strategy, that could mean so much. Because if you take the TikTok population right now and take it to the ballot, it's going to make a huge change who's going to be the next president.
So isn't that the crux of the matter, Tom, that you asked the question that how do you translate who the folks are on TikTok who are watching TikToks or who the folks are who can send a message on WhatsApp or whatever on their phone to somebody else? How do you translate that to millions of people under the age of 35, above 18, who are going to cast a vote?
It's all about strategy, isn't it?
Yeah, but also in that same token, Afrobarometer in 2022 showed that only 18% of Gen Z believe elections reflect the will of the people.
That's another thing. So you see, a friend of mine put up a poll recently at Google, usual, and that poll had around 96 people, and around over 20%, if I remember correctly, say that they wouldn't vote because they don't believe it makes actual change. That's the same reason we had low voter turnout and voter apathy in 2022 and the years before that. To make that turnaround is going to be hard. But we've seen a lot more people being involved politically. I like to say that it used to be a cool thing to say, I don't like politics on your Facebook profile.
It's trending, It was trending then.
But now you look foolish if you say that.
Right.
So to me, that signals a huge change that could mean something in 2022. And I hate to use 2022. I use it with restraint because 2027, isn't when change can come. It's an opportunity to make change, but between 2025 now and 2027 when the next election happens, so many things can be done. We can hold MPs accountable, and we saw it last year at a massive scale. And I believe there's so many opportunities between now and then that will have a huge impact on how 2027 goes. How involved people are between now and then is a huge deal. The problem is if people tone it down, if folks just sit back and they're like, that's a movement that died.
An apathy aspect of the thing. Okay, but then do we
see that, whether there are leadership of countries, doesn't really matter where you are, because we'll give an example. We had EndSARS in Nigeria. SARS was, of course, this group within the police who, for all intents and purposes, there was just wanton violence, and harassment of individuals. What happened after the protest is that the federal government decided that they were going to disband SARS. But what do they do with those police officers? They just transferred them to different parts of the police force in Nigeria.
They transferred them to SWAT, actually.
Essentially.
They created SWAT.
That's what they did.
You know?
So do we see that leadership whereby you would have an all-encompassing democracy then does things that are counterintuitive almost?
Yeah.
Because if a conducive environment for business, if a conducive environment for education and learning, business around civic education comes into play here, do we see that leadership is then working at cross purposes to this democracy around the continent?
Yeah. Yes. To use a local example, if I understand your question correctly, you mean leadership that does something and then does everything to withdraw whatever they did, if I understand your question.
Or to counter the objective in the very beginning.
Just counteractive in every way. You give an example of Nigeria, but then you have a local example. SPU was disbanded. But then last year, the kidnappings were done by a specific police unit, allegedly. I think that's
a good way to...
allegedly. Amnesty International came up with this report, and they mentioned a certain police unit. And the president actually said the same thing. He said that he's ordered the disbandment of any police unit that has been carrying out extrajudicial killings. You'll see it everywhere. You'll see it in Kenya, because you see a lot of anti-corruption policies that, like for instance, the conflict of interest bill right now, that is a condition of the World Bank. That's the president pushing for that in the House of the Assembly during his last State of the Nation address, and then doing everything to protect the people who are involved in corruption. You'll see it everywhere. For instance, the co-option of whatever the example you give from South Africa. Act like you're doing the right thing, then turn around and take everything back and then blame the people for doing something. For instance, what's happening now. I called you to the table. I was in your spaces I was on Twitter, but you people didn't show up on Twitter. While he was calling you on Twitter, a few weeks later, a few months later, he's grabbing you guys out of the streets and making you disappear for 2 weeks. I don't expect anything less of what I've seen, actually. I say this, there's always something that has not happened in Kenya for so many years happening every week. Like there's Butere Girls, and the next week there's something crazy happening.
There's a new flavor of the week. You mentioned the word handbook, and there's something I came across where we look at the way Gen Z activism is working, right? They have the onus and they have the rage. They don't have the rigor. They've got the spark. They've got the activity, right? But they don't have a means. They're operating in a vacuum. There's no support in terms of, yes, we go out and we make a lot of noise and everything's okay. So we benchmark outrage. We do not benchmark outcomes. You know, and
I disagree.
That's, for me, because like I said, there's a lot of there's only, I think, one example of those 4 boxes that I talked about. 2 examples actually. One is in Chile, 2019, when they actually called for a referendum. The other one is Senegal, Yanema, which stopped Wade from taking a third term in 2012. They didn't actually do I think when they tried to do the referendum in 2022, I think it still went back. But those aspects, and the thing about especially about Myanmar, is that at the point where they're talking about the sustainability, they have built a platform on which people are now, and it keeps coming back to that civic education. I want to know, as I'm not a Gen Z, but if a Gen Z goes and says, okay, fine, you know what, posting a picture of whatever will not necessarily translate into something actually happening. I can tweet about it till the cows come home, but where is the next? Okay, so I don't need more, as far as I'm concerned, I don't need more protest. And it comes back to what you're saying. I need more platforms. And those platforms can only come from a point of information. How do I make laws? I mean, I can dissect a soundbite to death, but do I know how to dissect a financial bill? If it comes to then saying, okay, fine, we want our voices heard. Do you know how to negotiate? First of all, do you know how the laws work? Do you have that financial equipment, or do you have the fluency in terms of just basically how politics works to say, fine, if we have a voice and we are allowed to be heard, this is what we propose. Youth trade fairs, I suppose we can look at things like representation. I have a stake at a seat at the AU, but I have no veto power, right? So what's the point? We become tokens for COP28. This girl from Uganda, Nkate.
Yeah, somebody to look at.
She is fantastic. She's a shining star. She did very well in terms of creating awareness about the environment, etc., etc. Uganda's national policy on environment has not changed, right? She was being funded, or rather, she was being propped by NGOs, which is good. I'm not saying that anything she did was wrong, but those changes did not happen, especially at national policy level. So the question then becomes, so how do we then transition from benchmarking outrage to benchmarking outcomes?
Good question. However, I'd ask this. Do we have to negotiate?
Well, I'd imagine. Because you can't come to the table. You can't say, fine, I'm willing to give you concessions. I'm willing to accommodate you. But what are you bringing to the table? I cannot negotiate from a position of nothing.
Does it... Frankly speaking,
no, by all means.
Frankly speaking, though, does it look like you have a political class that is listening to the people? Because to negotiate, you have to be hard, right?
Given, which is fine.
True, you need to be at the same table at the very least.
Yes.
But you also have to be at a level where you realize that you have to have influencer enough is not enough, and you don't have enough clout if you don't have the means to understand why you need to then have a voice.
I think the argument you're making assumes that there's a leadership that actually cares.
Okay. Nature abhors a vacuum. So do Gen Z become the new opposition?
They are, aren't they? They are.
Well, depending which... Okay.
The organization bit is what I mentioned is a bit shaky, you understand?
Yeah.
But they are. Is there, for instance, the finance bill, that's the best example out there. That bill was withdrawn because of Gen Zs. The political class was in bed with each other. Like, those folks had agreed that this is going through, right? And everything that has happened after has reinforced that the Gen Zs are the opposition, the official opposition in Kenya, for many reasons. They're the ones who take actions. They're the loudest people when it comes to actual issues. They stand against the government. I don't think we need to negotiate.
Okay.
Why do I say this? The finance bill is supposed to be tabled in the parliament, right? The parliament is a representation of the people.
It is.
The people had said no to the finance bill. Clearly said no to it. And the National Assembly is meant to be the voice that represents, doesn't make decisions for the people, represents the people. So what's negotiable about that? Why should we negotiate the finance bill when I clearly told you who represents me that it shouldn't go through? You understand?
It's a fair point.
It's written in the Constitution. If the majority says something, then let it go through. I think the problem with the political class in Kenya is they like to talk down on people. I know what's good for you. You don't know what's good for you. So if people ask for
if I want your opinion, I'll give it to you.
I'll get it.
Exactly.
I'll ask you for it. Well, I'll give it to you.
I'll give it to you. Yeah.
So then, in terms of democracy, when we're talking about an all-inclusive, people-led governance, are we essentially saying that this does not exist?
Yeah, it doesn't.
Currently, in its current form, that cynicism coming out from me, yes, it does not exist in any form or manner.
Yeah, so it doesn't exist, right?
At this point in time.
At this point in time, it doesn't exist. And that's because, obviously, the political class does not care about what the people want.
It's all about self-preservation.
It's all about self-preservation.
At the end of the day. Which then I would like to jump gears I want to jump gears because a part of that statement was this. Is Gen Z driving a true pan-African revival, or they're just keyboard crusaders waiting to be co-opted? Currently, insofar as I can see, right, we're very digital. We're very good. We're very good at mobile, right? We are raising what I'd call, and this is a reference obviously to Kenya, digital Kasmuels or digital Moraras. Right? Loud today, tomorrow they're gone. So basically what we're looking at is, if there's no memory, there's no movement. That's where I'm coming from now.
But to me, it looks as if we then assume that these people are the leaders of these movements. You understand? The thing you've said assumes that there has to be a leader in this. And leaders, if you have a leader, that's the person that goes to the table with these people and negotiates for you.
Which they
but
do.
They're not. those two individuals you mentioned, Morara and Kasmuel, those are not the leaders of the movement. They were the loudest during the movement. You'd remember Kasmuel's attendance of all rallies and him speaking, being the media representative of the movement, and Morara's Vampire Diaries series. At the prime, in their prime, that was, I think it was right after the protests when he started doing rounds around the country. Those are not the leaders of the movement. Co-option happens when they're the leaders, but the movement has existed well after they've been quote-unquote co-opted, right? We still hear loud talks about MPs and Butere girls, for instance. There was a lot of noise that made the president address it and his stooges. But the movement exists beyond these people, and I hate the idea that Gen Zs, whenever anyone says Gen Zs, you guys have been bought, I don't like buying that, because from the get-go, the movement said we are leaderless, we are tribeless, and they've lived up to it. Of course, there are going to be people who are going to be on the steering wheel, right? Hanifa and all the other activists, Boniface Mwangi, but those people stepped away from the movement. They can step away today and the movement will still exist, because there's so many people on TikTok, on Twitter, that advocate for change that they truly believe in. And the reason tribeless and leaderless is a thing is because people actually believe it. That's why Kasmuel turning wasn't a big deal.
So then how do you deal with those folks who fall along the way? And does it do any kind of damage to the movement, as it were, whereby you feel that there are certain people who said certain things with certain bravado, and they did that for a sustained period of time, but then after a while they fall off, and so folks who would look up to them as a possible person who would be their pivot then would get disappointed, because we must understand that as much as there's the brick and mortar of all of this, there's that will, power within the minds of many people that you want to identify with the leader. Great revolutions were all led by someone.
That's the thing. You had to have people. I think that's what threw the Reject Finance Bill, because the government was used to dealing with new here. So when they're dealing with a non-face entity, I think that's the first thing that actually threw them for a loop. But back to your question, how do you then...
How do you resonate? What do you do, essentially? Because here we are, we're saying there are people who led this, and then here we are seeing that they've become common bedfellows with government in one way or another. How do you deal with that and say, how do we pick it up and continue or keep lurching ahead if some of the generals essentially now are on the other side of things?
What I've seen and what I personally practice on social media and in my reporting, because journalism is at the end of the day a public service, right? You are a reflection of the people you speak for. I do my part, and that's what everyone is doing. I do my part. The finance bill was out 2 nights ago, and the moment it came out, there was a ChatGPT model that had been trained on it to break it down to people, for people. The same thing we saw during the movement at the peak of Reject Finance Bill. People were translating it into all languages on Instagram, on TikTok. I think it's the personal initiative that is driving this movement now.
And those platforms, like I said, we need not necessarily so many protests, but the fact that we have platforms now, we can have stuff translated, and you have an AI system that actually breaks it down to whatever. Those are the kind of platforms I think that will make a much bigger impact. And I'm not saying protests don't work. I mean, obviously they have to start. The passion has to start from there. But then that comes now to my sustainability. Things like platforms like that now create that sustainability. Sorry to interrupt.
I feel as if for this movement to keep the fire burning, there has to be a personal initiative from everyone. So if you're an artist, and we saw this during the protests, artists made music and showed up and rallied their followers to come onto the streets. For a journalist, for instance, if I want to see change as a journalist, I will report on everything without being muzzled. If I am an accountant, if the finance bill comes out and I'm CPA, I break it down into a thread, right?
That makes sense.
If I am a politician and I wish to lend myself to the movement, what do? I speak about it in the House of Parliament. Now the problem is we don't have that, and that's what hamstrings this movement.
The other thing, and I'll keep coming back to this, I'm sorry, this is my cynicism. I'm going to read something for you that I was looking at in terms of my research. Today's youth activists know how to trend, but not how to transition. Who is mentoring them? Are we just recycling revolutionaries into PR? I think that mentorship aspect is very critical,
yeah.
you know, because like I said, we have the impetus, rather the youth have the impetus, but they're not being pointed in the right direction.
Or are the movements made up of folks who are bold enough?
Yeah.
And I guess that's a very uncomfortable thing. Are we bold enough? Are they bold enough to say, well, look at the people who did it before? Kwame Nkrumah was not even 40 years old. Thomas Sankara, neither was he. He was in his late 20s. Look at folks like Patrice Lumumba, who were not in their 40s yet, who died for the cause, essentially. And look at, of course, we want to go to the cliche man of the moment is Ibrahim Traore. He's 37 years old. And folks who are not scared to say, well, do what you need to do, but I'm not going to sit back and allow this to happen. Now, we're talking about 75% of the African population. 70% of billions of people is a lot of people who, with one resolve, can actually, move things along. Are we ready? Social media is a very safe space.
Is it?
It is.
Extremely.
Well,
from my reading is yes, it is. I can sit back and say, yeah, okay, fine.
I can put it on X.
Down with and then I sit back and
I can say it. I can say the must go. I can say end.
But it's not happening on social media only, is it?
Where is it happening? And I think that's the question. That where is it happening so much so that with consistent, repetitive, deliberate, intentional effort, that we can then see change will come about.
Bashir was kicked out.
Yes, he was. People slept on the streets.
Yes. Yeah. Bashir was kicked out, but the regime that came after that basically shut down everything again. So all that civil movement from the activists at that point, and there was still actually the Gen Z aspect, they came and they said, okay, Bashir out and everything, and then the military came in and they shut it down again immediately. Yeah. Right? So now, again, the question is, so how do you then manage that where you've got the impetus, you've got whatever, but I'm happy to sit behind my keyboard, this Keyboard Crusaders, and finish Netflix when I finish my next tweet. Yeah. As opposed to people, and unfortunately this happened in Kenya, it's happened around the world and everywhere, where people actually lose their lives, where they become martyrs for a cause? Yeah. Are they going to be remembered, or are we going to move on to the next soundbite or whatever happened?
We have seen it happening. It's not happening online, guys. Come on. It's not only happening on Twitter. The Keyboard Crusaders thing is... It's a nice thing. You can say you almost sound like
it's a nice soundbite.
It sounds nice. Sounds like what
and it's got alliteration to it as well. So, I see where you're coming from.
and you actually would be friends with what's his name, the Kikuyu member of parliament, the Kimani Ichung'wah, the leader of the National Assembly here in Kenya. Well, he said iPhones and water bottles and KFC. Well, that's everything you've just described. Netflix, but it's not happening to those people only. What did we see when land was being grabbed in Kilgoris in Kenya? We saw young Maasai men who are within the Gen Z bracket stepping up and protesting. That's because of carbon credits, right? It's such a should I say complicated subject, but they understand the implications of it.
Sure. So I think there's also, interestingly enough, I believe that there is an appetite of the older generation and it's almost a willing to see that this youth bracket actually does keep sustaining this movement. Because in certain capacities, the older generation is unable to without that kind of support, or even for them to follow up with it. There's almost a desire, and we can see that yes, I fully support what's going on with the Gen Z movement, whether it is in Kenya, whether it is in South Africa, whether it is in Namibia, whereby they said, stop, molesting and killing our young women, regardless of where that was.
And that's because it speaks to everyone, right? That's because it speaks to everyone. And for instance, the Traore situation is because everyone just feels subservient to a certain power, and this leader kicking out these people gives them strength, right? It does that, and at the end of the day, I think that's what matters, that this thing speaks to you. But something that we haven't spoken about in this conversation is how big of an influence the Constitution is to these movements that we see right now.
Okay,
you understand? Because this mheshimiwa term that is being used is it's rubbish these days because you're supposed to represent me. You're my employee.
Honorable or dishonorable?
It's dishonorable.
Yeah.
Absolutely dishonorable. We don't even know where that came from because there's nothing respectable about them. And it's the constitution. When the protests were at their peak, what did you hear people say? The people may. Right? When people were being grabbed off the streets, what do you hear people say? People said freedom of expression is enshrined in the constitution. So every single thing that is being spoken of in these protests can be traced back to the constitution. That's also another strength, that people know the constitution and it's not illegal to say it.
Civic education.
Civic education.
Back there.
Still comes back to that. So I might have the most amazing movement in the world. If I don't, I know my rights, but that's probably from I can't say that I know the constitution enough. I'm not a lawyer, which is fine. But like you said earlier, there are people who now are able to then pass that on. But it needs to be taught at primary level, for example. You know, it can't be at the level where we see it on TV, and that's about it. And that's where a lot of our generation, not our generation, our youth, consume politics from social media and memes, not actually then saying, okay, fine, what is civic policy based on this? Where's the education point? Where are the touch points in terms of how I can then say I'm actually making a move or movement because I am coming from an informed position, as opposed to, for example, and unfortunately, again, I'm going to come back, and even in Nigeria and with the techie, the Lekki toll, where people were killed, where there's a mass euphoria to say, okay, fine, we are going against because it's counter to this and what have you, but you end up losing your life for not necessarily any particular reason other than the fact that you got caught up in the euphoria. You know?
But don't people come from an informed perspective, from a point of view, and they speak about things these days? I think they do.
I think the jury is, for me, I think the jury is a bit out on that. Because I'll go back to what I said before. As Gen Z activists can break down sound bites. They can probably look at something and say, okay, that's been generated by AI. But ask them to tell you what the finance bill is all about. Where does it talk about, for example, exemptions on renewable energy sources? Right? Those kind of things. You know, I mean, okay, it might not affect them in the biggest in the bigger scheme of things. But if you're to then look at, if I'm going to just touch on this very briefly. If I'm going to then say, as a Gen Z, we want to look at a continent that's all inclusive, I will then go and say, okay, fine. According to by 2050, we're going to have a 52.3% Africa Free Trade area. We're going to be able to have 52.3% inter-Africa trade, which is good. From a top level, that sounds fantastic.
Right.
Let me come to you as a Gen Z. How does inter-Africa trading tariffs affect local manufacturing? That's where I'm coming from. From that perspective, that depth, that knowledge has to be a lot deeper than saying we're going to protest because we have. I mean, we have our memes are borderless, but that does not mean
tribeless.
And but then doesn't mean that the continent is borderless.
Has to be.
But people start somewhere, don't they?
Have to start somewhere.
Right. Indeed. What would be your final thoughts on that? How do we start? How do we continue to keep them, to keep these issues, or to keep these ideas, to keep these movements front and center?
By speaking up. By speaking up. I think I can't speak about this. I can't do anything about this. The reason the bill was big was because the finance bill protests were big was because it was the number one trending hashtag globally. Like pressure was on the streets and online. The Butere girl situation as well. Speak to anyone on the streets and they'll tell you they know about echoes of war. Because people spoke about it, because people online were making noise about this tear gassing of young children and the center of the play being this person who is widely unpopular in the country. People speaking up is what is front and center of this. If I, as a journalist, can speak about the over 60 people who were murdered and how over 1 year later nothing has happened, if I can make noise about the ODPP's recent statement about killing all these cases and lack of evidence and the police not being involved, if I can speak about how terrible and to some degree offensive those statements are and the things that members of parliament do, as a journalist lending my voice to these things, that means you can reach somebody on TikTok who
you can make a difference.
Exactly.
It only starts at that. Is it Nelson Mandela? You don't have to see the top of the stairs. You just need to take that first step. And that spark is what actually now.
And that's what I told you earlier. Some things start somewhere. People being vocal now. We didn't hear the noise that we're hearing about Twitter and TikTok in 2017, at least not as loudly, right? No. It was there, but not as loudly. The reason we're hearing about it is because it's actually applying pressure somewhere. So people speaking up does matter. Do what you can. Make noise about the things that matter to you. Because if the press is muzzled, I as a journalist you should be able to step outside and say, don't jail journalists, don't kill and pull advertising from TV stations. Just not being silent. That's enough, I think, to take this movement forward.
Okay. Thank you so much, Tom.
Thank you for the invite, guys.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us.
And it's been a candid and wonderful conversation.
Absolutely.
You know?
Don't be cynical.
Don't be cynical. I'll try not to. I'm taking that hat off now.
Throw it away.
Thank you so much for engaging with us on Panel 54, where we rethink the world one African perspective at a time. If it made you pause, reflect, or reframe, don't forget to share it. Start the conversation that we just said, and do remember to tag us. Remember, you can find us on your favorite social media platforms at Panel 54 Pod, and of course you can also find us on your favorite streaming platforms, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and remember to keep the lens clean. That's Panel 54, Global Lens through an African perspective.